Hello and welcome to LifeSiteNews. My name is Jim Hale, and I am so pleased to introduce to you today one of the great freedom fighters in America who is here today to talk to us about what is going on in Cuba, talk about the history of the terror of the Cuban Revolution and what we might expect going forward. So Maria Werlau, welcome to LifeSiteNews.
Thank you, Jim. Glad to be here.
So, Maria, when I say you're one of the great freedom fighters, I mean that. You and I worked very closely together some 20 years ago in Washington, D.C., when we were working for Americans for a Free Cuba and the Congressional Cuban Political Prisoners Initiative. And I know that was something I did for just a little over a year, but this is something you've devoted your whole life to. So if you would please talk to us about what the Cuba Archive is all about and about your history.
Sure. Well, let's start with Cuba Archive. Cuba Archive is what I call an activist think tank. We do investigations and research and produce factual information and reports to advance human rights in Cuba and then in Venezuela and places where Cuba has intervened. And we founded Cuba Archive about 21. And it's a nonprofit based in the United States, but we have different projects. Amongst them is we document disappearances and deaths, killings by the state. And actually, we foment the right to life and the culture of life overall. So we don't just document deaths on one side, we document the loss of life on all sides, what this conflict, what this revolution has cost the Cuban people.
Can you just give us I know we're going to go into more detail about this, but tell us what is going on right now.
Right. So right now, July 11th on Sunday, spontaneous and massive protests erupted all over Cuba. It started in, curiously, a small town outside of Havana, San Antonio de los Baños, where there is the largest air base. Military base, and there's several military neighborhoods. So this was an odd place to start. But since there is, they have cell phones, Cuba almost has no landlines. Everyone has a cell phone. And this was a government decision some years back to collect money from family, because Cubans can't pay their own bills. They have to come from abroad, family and friends. So this is because of the social media. This immediately got out to other towns and cities where people massively came out peacefully to demonstrate. As they saw that it was happening elsewhere, they sort of overcame their historic and ingrained fear. And the most amazing thing is they went to the street chanting for freedom and down with communism and down with the dictatorship. Yes, you know, a lot of the media has said this has to do with people clamoring for food and electricity and medicine because the situation in Cuba is desperate. But the amazing thing is that what most people were chanting was for freedom and down with the dictatorship. And so this was pretty shocking for the government. It took them by surprise. And they didn't let this move very, for many hours. They started to, repress the crowds. We don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands of people are detained and technically disappeared because they don't give information as to where they're taken or how they are. So it's a desperate situation, but it's clearly a new day in Cuba. I think we will see the Cuba situation as before and after July 11th.
Can you... It's always amusing, and now it's, of course, very predictable. It's gotten worse, of course, in the last 20 years since you and I were working for democracy in Cuba. But just the way the leftist media is portraying this, it's almost like they don't know what to do. All they can say is, well, this is because of the economic sanctions, when we've heard that for 70 years now, right?
I didn't hear anybody in the streets of Cuba, and there's tons of videos saying down with the embargo. Not one. In fact, some people flew US flags. But here's the thing. What people need to understand is the embargo, or the US sanctions as people know it, is a very complex policy, but it allows for the United States, that flows in through telephone, humanitarian material aid, cash remittances to the tune of $6 billion a year. On top of that, the embargo, there are two laws that exempt food and agricultural products, as well as any medical equipment, medical supplies, drugs to keep to the embargo. So by law, they're not included in the sanctions. Cuba can import and does import medical equipment, except they feed this propaganda to ignorance who buy it.
Well, right. And of course, it's always worth pointing out that while we do have economic sanctions against Cuba, Cuba can trade with whoever else they want in the entire world. Canada, the EU, of course, their longtime allies, Russia. You know, where are the Russians? So nobody wants to talk about the real reason is because communist economic policy is a disaster to begin with.
Right, and technically bankrupt since 1986, when it defaulted on billions of dollars in credits from capitalist countries, the Paris Club, and they defaulted on every debt that they have had. I think if we could really tally the amount of international credit going from capitalist countries to Cuba in the last 6 decades, it would probably be historic in the history.
Maria, where do you think this is going? I mean, do you have information that the government is cracking down hard right now?
Oh, very much so. Despite the fact that they've cut internet and telephone communications, as well as electricity in a lot of places on the island, people have found a way through VPN and other means that I don't know, I don't have the technical ability to explain, to get video out. If everyone has a telephone, they're cracking down hard. It's terrible already. The government has confirmed just one death of a civilian that they said was committing violence, etc. It's hard to say. I mean, there's just this morning a video on camera. You see a policeman breaking into a home where there's 3 children. Just because the husband of this woman who films the video attended the protest in a town called Cubanas in Matanzas province. And you see the police and you hear the shots and you see the blood, and the woman is screaming that they shot him, just an unarmed civilian. So this is going on. It's hard to tell how much. I've talked to people on the island and received text messages from some, and also have information of people who are in touch, and it's pretty bad. They're disappearing people, arresting people. I mean, the terror apparatus is in full force, and they do have the means to contain it because that's what they're better prepared for.
We reached a tipping point where there are enough Cubans who are just so desperate. I mean, will they be able to overcome this? Will the military ever, get to a point where they will say, okay, it's time to be with the people now? Like, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, several things. I mean, it's hard to tell. First of all, I've studied the mechanisms of repression in Cuba. Cuba has a higher surveillance rate than the Stasi had in the former East Germany, higher than the KGB in the former Soviet Union. It's very, very well institutionalized. They prepared the mechanism, the troops and civilians, people, thugs dressed in civilians who are thugs of the state are out with bats, and all sorts of things to beat people up, and they're doing it. But I think this is going to create a momentum that will be hard to sort of put down all the time. As a priest, I just listened to a video from a priest in Camagüey who said very bravely, you know what? They cannot repress all the people all the time everywhere. So eventually something might crack. It could take a while.
What is the state of the church right now in Cuba? Do we have, the liberation theologists that are just, puppets of the regime, or do we have some heroic priests like this gentleman that you're talking about?
It's a sad thing to say. I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic schools, loved the Catholic Church. I'm very disappointed historically at the role of the Catholic Church. They made a pact with the devil. And the church is heavily infiltrated from everything I've heard from defectors. And, it's obvious. Finally, yesterday, the bishops put out a very weak statement calling for the end of violence, but not talking about freedom, not talking about dictatorship. There are some very brave priests. I've known some of them, and I know some of them right now.
Right.
Actually, a priest in Camagüey was beat over the head and detained. There's 3 pastors, Baptist pastors that we know, were taken from their homes and arrested on Sunday. They don't know the whereabouts. So they're cracking down on not just, those within the Catholic Church and other faith who are taking a role.
It doesn't help, too, that, we were so eager back, in the early days of the papacy of Pope Francis, when he visited Cuba, didn't have one word of criticism, standing in front of Che Guevara's mural. But then, of course, he came to the United States a couple of days later and unloaded on us. I know that must have been very disappointing to you.
It was terrible. For me, it was personally terrible. And you know what? I'm glad my mother was dead to not see it, because she was very, very affected by this. It's so interesting right now to watch how this is being covered, and just reading the reports. And even when you're watching the videos, you can't help but just kind of read descriptions of how this is such a confusing time for the American left, because everyone is so enamored with Marxism now and socialism. And I think they like to think of Cuba, and everyone's taking trips to Cuba now. And they just can't understand why these Cuban people would be so upset. I mean, I guess all I have to tell people like that is, if you go on a tourist trip to Cuba, try to get into any clinic or hospital that is not within the list of 14 facilities open to hard currency paying foreigners and the nomenclatura, the leadership of the country. Just try to walk in and take pictures, and they will see what it is to live in socialism. And they will see that it's a propaganda creation, that it's false. And the Cubans demonstrated in mass, setting aside fears that are so ingrained, because they live with this, they can be disappeared, they can be put in prison, most have to get on a raft to try to flee. And they break that because they lived that reality. And now the left is left without their typical narrative. All they're left is, it's the US embargo. But it's interesting, I've spoken to people who've gone on academic trips, even lawyers who go to Cuba, come back, they never even read the criminal code or the Constitution of Cuba. Right. They just eat up these propaganda Potemkin tours. And it's just stunning to me. Obviously many don't speak the language, but they don't know basic facts. Like, I remember one trip from a university that they actually came to Miami and asked to see me, which is stunning because most don't even do that. And they thought there's no soap in Cuba. This was years back, because of the embargo. Right now, months ago, I've heard stories. There's no plaster to set a cast for broken bones. There's no aspirin to lower fever. I mean, people don't understand that the average monthly wage in Cuba is $40 a month. It's one of the lowest, if not the lowest in the world. They don't know basic things. So I think this is a big, big awakening for the world who's eaten up this propaganda, because a lot of the mainstream media has fed it, and now they're left with, the Cuban people have given you the lesson of your life. Spoken.
Right. Well, let's hope so, because Americans will continue going on their useful idiot tours, just like they've always done. They did it back in the Soviet Union, back in the 20s, during the height of Stalin's terror in the 20s and 30s, and still wanted to tell us about what a great place the Soviet Union was.
What people have to understand is Cuba opened up to state capitalism and tourism from the world, from the capitalist world. And the argument was, if we engage Cuba, they will democratize, they will see, right. They will open up. The opposite has happened. Yeah. Millions of Canadians, Spaniards, Chileans, Brazilians have gone to Cuba, Italians, French. And what you have is enclave capitalism in tourist spots, and very tightly controlled. And, nothing has really spilled down. No, there's been no dispersion effect. People know what freedom is. They just cannot exercise it.
As someone once said, how many McDonald's do you have to open before you stop torturing your own people?
I welcome every opportunity to educate people with facts, because I think the facts speak for themselves. If you get them right, we don't have to exaggerate what goes on in Cuba. Like, for example, in our deaths and disappearances database, which is a fraction of what we believe is. But we have attributed to the Castro regime, 3,500 executions, firing squad executions, almost 2,000 extrajudicial killings, a lot of prisoners dead from minor medical conditions. And people say, no, there's many more. We said, we don't have to inflate that. Every case, every human life is important. Well, and we, here is, we go to the streets to protest, police abuse against one person. And then you have hundreds, thousands, repressed for 6 decades, and people don't seem to care.
Well, Maria, this is a very personal situation for you. As you said, that your entire adult life you've devoted to promoting democracy in Cuba. If you could just talk to me a little bit about what this means to you personally.
My whole life has been around this issue, even when it was not obvious, because both my parents were part of the resistance and the fight against the Batista dictatorship. And, my life started surrounded by that. My father was in the Sierra Maestra fighting under Che Guevara against Batista, and my mother was in an urban cell. And then they realized immediately when the revolution started that there was a communist conspiracy, and that the promise of restoring democracy, elections, the Constitution was a farce. My father then immediately started to conspire against the Castro regime with his buddies from the resistance against Batista. Many of them were executed. Many of the people from the resistance against Batista were executed immediately by the Castros because they knew how effective that could be with a band of brothers almost, a very little group. They were able to topple a dictatorship. So my mother was left a widow, and the turmoil in my young days of the suffering that I saw, the family separated, children being sent, my mother had a lot of cousins who were young, who were sent by their parents because they were going to be indoctrinated and captured by the state. The parents lose control over their own children in a communist state, because it's not just that Cuba is under a dictatorship. Is that those dictators, those criminals, because we document their crimes against humanity, are celebrated by the world. After the Obama trip, it sort of opened the dam, and everybody went to Cuba to kiss the dictators. We've had Jimmy Carter play ball with Castro. I mean, the Obamas do the wave in a baseball stadium in Cuba. Those are very, very hurtful things, because there's been so much suffering in Cuba, and it's not just a loss of life. Every Cuban has a story. Families separated, people's lives reduced to misery their whole lives because they are peons of the state. It's a totalitarian state that owns all the economy. The laws are really Stalinist, if that word fits today. After the collapse of that failed system, it's alive in Cuba. It's really terrible. And finally, and here's the irony, Cuba has fomented this type of insurrection. In the 1980s, Cuba was behind dozens of uprisings all over Latin America against the external debt. And they have agents. I mean, the intelligence services have worked very ably and very consistently to recruit, these movements, and to be supported by the academia and the intellectuals and the media, et cetera. And they've managed to do this. And the insurrections that started in Latin America in 2019, again, Cuba is behind that. The thing is that here's the beauty. That's why there is a divine order, I think. This is a real symmetrical war, but it's the war of the people, unarmed, that just, decided I want liberty. I want my freedom.
So Maria, what do you think is gonna happen? Will the regime just bludgeon the people as the world ignores the reality, or will the people finally be victorious in Cuba?
The regime is repressing it. They're stopping it. They can do it. They're doing it violently. I think the big difference is the world now knows. They can't ignore it. It's in their face. I think it's really important to get internet back to Cuba. Somehow the free governments of the world have to find a way for people, because that's what gave people the ability to see, hey, others are doing it, I'm doing it, hell, I'm going to the streets. It's hard to say what can happen. I think at this juncture, the only thing that could happen is a fracture at the top. Somebody within, the elite, the military. Is it probable? I can't say that. It's impossible to say.
Well, what would you like to see from the Biden administration?
First, to not loosen sanctions now. That would be a real mistake. To open channels of humanitarian assistance directly from the people to the people, not going through the government. I think that's what needs to be done right now. And the Biden administration has to be very determined in that, because right now, for instance, they also have to be very forceful in telling Cuba, do not promote a massive migration wave. We will consider this an act of war, because it's already happening. They're already doing it. I mean, I've been picking up the signs, they're very obvious. And then yesterday, the foreign minister came out and said it openly. They're threatening the Biden administration.
Well, Maria, thank you very much. I know you're very busy right now, and you're doing a lot of interviews. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It's an honor to talk to you. Just so admire the work that you are doing. It was always an honor to work with you on Cuban democracy, and I pray for all the work that you're doing going forward, my friend.
Thank you so much. I always think in the end, I wish my real hope for Cuba is a lot of love. Because Cuba has lived with this rhetoric of hatred, division, class war, all sorts of, aggressions to the human soul. That the only way that the Cubans are going to rise and put that behind is with love. And that's how a peaceful transition can happen. I don't think we should lose hope on that. And it's always been a pleasure, Jim, to know you and see your work. So thanks for the opportunity. And I hope the readers can go to cubaarchive.org and see some of the information that we have there on Cuba.
Thank you. God bless you. Maria Werlau joining us today from San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.